The bitter cold Montana wind rattled the cabin's shutters as Zara Finch huddled under her threadbare blanket, wondering if she'd made the greatest mistake of her life. The year was 1873, and the promise of land and independence had lured her west. After her parents' passing, left her with nothing but their debts in Boston. But winter had arrived early, and with it, a bone-chilling reality that no amount of Eastern education had prepared her for. Zara's fingers trembled as she tried to coax a spark from the last of her matches. Her supply of firewood had dwindled to nearly nothing, and the thought of venturing out to chop more in the approaching blizzard made her stomach clench with fear. The flame caught briefly before sputtering out, leaving her in the growing darkness as tears of frustration threatened to spill. "Not now," she whispered to herself, straightening her shoulders. "You didn't come all this way to freeze to death in your first winter." A sudden pounding at her door made her jump, the sound almost lost in a particularly violent gust of wind. For a moment she wondered if she'd imagined it. Visitors were rare even in fair weather, and no one in their right mind would be traveling with a storm bearing down. The pounding came again, more insistent this time. Zara grabbed the shotgun her neighbor had insisted she keep and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Madam, I've got a wagon full of supplies about to be scattered across the territory if this wind picks up any more." The voice was deep, weathered by the elements. "Just need shelter till morning." Zara hesitated, her heart racing. Being alone with a stranger went against everything proper society had taught her, but refusing aid to a traveler in such weather could mean death for him and possibly for her too. If she couldn't get her fire started again. "I'm armed," she warned, sliding back the bolt. The man who stood on her porch was tall, his broad shoulders dusted with snow, a cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. His clothes were worn but clean, and his boots caked with mud. "Xavier Thornton, madam," he said, removing his hat to reveal eyes the color of a summer sky and hair as dark as midnight. "I was heading to Billings when the storm caught up with me faster than expected." Zara kept the shotgun visible, but lowered it slightly. "Zara Finch, you can come in but leave your guns by the door." Xavier nodded, carefully unbuckling his gun belt and setting it down as requested. "Much obliged. Got some supplies in the wagon that might help us both weather this storm, if you'll allow me to bring them in." For the first time, Zara noticed the wagon behind him, a large canvas-covered affair with two horses stamping nervously in the growing wind. "You should stable your horses in the lean-to-out back," she said, making a quick decision. "Then bring in whatever you need." Xavier flashed a grateful smile that brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks. "Won't take but a minute. Mind if I bring in some firewood first? Looks like you could use some heat in here." Zara glanced at her cold hearth and nodded, embarrassed but practical. "Yes, please." Within half an hour, Xavier had settled his horses, brought in an armload of firewood, and stacked a surprising number of supplies on her small table: coffee, bacon, beans, and even a small sack of sugar. "I can't accept all this," Zara protested, looking at the bounty. Xavier was kneeling by her fireplace, expertly arranging kindling. "Consider it payment for shelter. Besides, I've got plenty more in Billings waiting for me." With practiced movements, he struck a match and touched it to the kindling. The flame caught immediately, growing steadily as he added larger pieces of wood. Soon, a cheerful fire was crackling in the hearth, pushing back the darkness and bringing life to the cabin that had felt like a tomb just moments before. "There we go," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Nothing better than a good fire on a night like this." Zara moved closer to the welcome heat, watching as this stranger, this cowboy, made himself at home in her small space. "You seem to know your way around a fireplace." "Been living outdoors most of my life," he replied, setting a pot of coffee to boil. "Fire's the difference between life and death out here." As the cabin slowly warmed, Zara felt something inside her warming too, a small spark of hope that had nearly been extinguished by loneliness and fear. "So, Miss Finch," Xavier said, settling into the chair across from her, "what brings a lady like yourself to this particular piece of nowhere?" The question was direct but not unkind, and Zara found herself answering honestly. "My parents died, leaving nothing but debts. The land office in Boston had pamphlets about homesteading opportunities. It seemed possible. Xavier nodded, his expression thoughtful rather than pitying. Possible is about right. Not easy, but possible with the right knowledge and preparation. He glanced around the cabin. You've done well for a newcomer, but winter out here isn't forgiving of mistakes. I'm learning that, Zara admitted, looking at her hands. They were no longer the smooth, pale hands of a Boston lady, but roughened by months of hard work. I thought I had more time before the snow. First rule of Montana weather: does what it wants, when it wants. Xavier poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. Second rule: neighbors help neighbors, even when they've just met. The coffee was strong and hot, bringing feeling back to Zara's fingers. And what's the third rule? A smile played at the corners of Xavier's mouth. Always keep your gun clean and your horse fed. Despite herself, Zara laughed, the sound strange in the cabin that had known only her quiet determination for months. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks, I'll show you how to properly chop and stack wood for maximum efficiency, Xavier offered. And maybe we can reinforce that lean-to of yours. Won't do to have it collapse under the snow weight. Why would you help me? Zara asked, genuinely curious. Men, in her experience, always wanted something in return. Xavier's eyes met hers steadily. Because someone did the same for me when I first came west. Man named Johnson found me half frozen my first winter, taught me what I needed to know to survive. Figure I'm just passing along the favor. As the night deepened and the storm howled outside, they talked. Xavier told her of his years driving cattle, of the boom and bust cycle of mining towns, and of the vast, untamed beauty of the territories. Zara spoke of Boston, of her father's failed investments, and of her determination to make this new life work despite the odds. By the time they settled in for the night, Xavier insisting on making his bed on the floor near the fire, while Zara took the small bed behind a makeshift curtain, something had changed in the cabin. It wasn't just the welcome warmth from the fireplace. It was the presence of another human voice, another heartbeat defying the wilderness together. As Zara drifted to sleep, she realized the cowboy had lit more than just a fire in her hearth. He had rekindled something she thought she'd left behind in Boston: hope, and perhaps something more dangerous to a woman alone on the frontier: interest in a man with summer sky eyes and hands that created warmth from nothing. Morning arrived with a crystalline clarity that only follows a winter storm. Zara woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, momentarily disoriented by the sounds of movement in her cabin. Then, the events of the previous night came flooding back, and she quickly dressed behind the curtain that separated her sleeping area from the main room. Xavier stood at her small cook stove, looking surprisingly at ease for a man accustomed to cooking over campfires. "Morning," he called without turning around. "Hope you're hungry. Storm's passed, but it's left quite a blanket out there." Zara moved to the window, gasping at the transformation. Her small clearing was covered in at least 2 feet of pristine snow, the morning sun turning it into a sea of diamonds. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Beautiful and dangerous," Xavier replied, sliding a plate of bacon and beans toward her. "We've got work to do if you're going to be prepared for the next one." After breakfast, Xavier trudged through the snow to check on his horses and wagon. He returned with an axe that looked far superior to Zara's dull, second-hand tool. "First lesson," he announced, leading her to a fallen pine not far from the cabin. "Choosing the right wood. This one's been seasoning for months. See how the needles are all gone and the bark is starting to loosen? That means it'll burn cleaner and hotter." Throughout the morning, Xavier demonstrated the proper way to swing an axe, how to split logs along their grain, and the importance of creating a woodpile that would stay dry through snow and rain. Zara watched, tried, failed, and tried again, determined to master these skills. "You're a quick study," Xavier commented as she successfully split a log on her 3rd attempt. "Most folks take longer to get the hang of it." "I've always been a good student," Zara replied, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cold. "Though I admit this is quite different from literature and mathematics." Xavier laughed, the sound clear in the winter air. "I reckon Shakespeare won't keep you warm at night, though a good head for figures might help with rationing supplies." By midday, they had chopped enough wood to last Zara at least 2 weeks. After a simple lunch, Xavier turned his attention to the lean to where his horses and Zara's mule were sheltered. "This needs reinforcing before another storm hits," he declared, examining the rough structure. From his wagon, he produced tools and even some spare lumber. "I always carry building supplies. Never know when you'll need to fix something on the trail." Together, they worked through the afternoon, adding supports and patching holes in the lean-to's roof. Zara held boards while Xavier hammered, handed him tools before he asked for them, and gradually began to understand the practical logic behind his improvements. As the sun began its early winter descent, they stood back to admire their work. The lean-to was now sturdy enough to withstand the weight of heavy snow, and Zara's woodpile was neatly stacked and covered. "I can't thank you enough," Zara said, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, their breath forming matching clouds in the cold air. "No need for thanks," Xavier replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "But I should be moving on tomorrow if the trails are passable. Got deliveries waiting in Billings." Disappointment settled in Zara's chest, surprising in its intensity. One day with company had made the prospect of solitude seem unbearable again. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady. "You've been more than generous with your time and supplies." That evening, as they sat by the fire eating a stew Xavier had prepared from his supplies and some dried vegetables from Zara's stores, a comfortable silence settled between them. "What will you do in Billings?" Zara finally asked. Xavier stretched his long legs toward the fire. "Got a freight contract with some merchants there, running supplies between Billings and the smaller settlements through winter, then back to cattle driving come spring." "You don't have a permanent home?" Something flickered across his face. "Regret, perhaps, or longing?" "Not yet. Been saving to buy a small ranch someday, somewhere in a valley with good water and shelter from the worst storms." "That sounds lovely," Zara said softly, trying to imagine such a place and finding that in her mind it looked remarkably like her own small homestead, but with stronger buildings and cattle grazing on the hills. "What about you?" Xavier asked. "What's your plan once you prove up this land?" The question caught her off guard. In truth, she'd been so focused on surviving that she hadn't thought much beyond securing her claim. "I suppose I'll farm it, maybe raise some chickens, a cow or two." "Alone?" The word hung between them, loaded with meaning. Zara met his gaze steadily. "That was the plan. Not many other options for a woman on her own out here." Xavier nodded slowly. "It's a hard life, even for two people working together. Solo," he shook his head. "You've got grit, Miss Finch, I'll give you that." "Zara," she corrected him. "After chopping wood together all day, I think you can call me Zara." A smile spread across his face, transforming his weathered features. "Zara it is, and I'm Xavier to my friends." "Are we friends then?" she asked, surprised by her own boldness. "I'd like to think so," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "Maybe even good friends in time." The look that passed between them sent warmth flooding through Zara that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she felt not just the determination to survive, but a desire to live fully in this wild place. Morning brought clear skies and the realization that Xavier would indeed be leaving. After a breakfast of the last of the bacon and some biscuits Zara had quickly made, he began loading his wagon. "The trail to Billings should be passable by midday," he said, securing his supplies. "The sun will melt the worst of it on the main paths." Zara nodded, trying not to show her disappointment. "Thank you again for everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't arrived when you did." Xavier paused in his work, turning to face her fully. "I've been thinking about that. I'll be making regular runs between Billings and the outlying homesteads all winter. Your place is right on my route." Hope fluttered in Zara's chest. "Is it?" "Could be," he said with a slight smile. "Would it be presumptuous to ask if I might stop here on my way back? Check on your woodpile, maybe bring some supplies you can't get locally?" "I would like that very much," Zara replied, unable to hide her smile. Xavier's expression softened. "Then it's settled. I should be back this way in about 2 weeks, weather permitting." As he hitched his horses to the wagon, Zara impulsively went into the cabin and returned with a small parcel wrapped in cloth. "For your journey," she said, handing it to him. "Just some biscuits and a bit of honey I traded for last autumn." Xavier's fingers brushed hers as he accepted the gift, the brief contact sending a jolt through her. "Much appreciated. The trail can be lonely." "I understand lonely," Zara said quietly. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, might even step closer, but instead he tucked the parcel carefully into his coat. 2 weeks, he promised, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Keep that fire burning." As Zara watched him drive away, the horses breaking a path through the snow, she knew she would keep more than just the hearth fire burning. Something else had been kindled, something warm and hopeful that no winter storm could extinguish. True to his word, Xavier returned exactly 2 weeks later, his wagon laden with supplies from Billings. The delight on Zara's face when she opened her door to his knock was worth every freezing mile he'd traveled. "You came back," she said, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Said I would, didn't I?" Xavier replied, stamping snow from his boots. "And I brought some things you might need." Those things turned out to be practical treasures: a new axe head, better quality flour than she could get at the nearest trading post, lamp oil, coffee, and even a small bag of hard candies that made her eyes light up like a child's. "These are too much," she protested, though her fingers lingered on the candy sack. "Consider it business," Xavier said with a wink. "I'm a freight hauler now, and you're on my route. Just tell me what you need, and I'll bring it next time." That visit lasted 2 days, as a light snowfall made the trails slick. Together, they repaired a loose shutter, improved the drainage around the cabin foundation, and in the evenings sat by the fire talking of their lives before Montana and their hopes for the future. When Xavier left this time, the goodbye was harder. Zara stood in the doorway long after his wagon disappeared over the rise. The cabin feeling emptier than it had before, she knew the fullness of his presence. Over the next 3 months, a pattern emerged. Every 2 to 3 weeks, Xavier's wagon would appear on the horizon, bringing supplies, news from town, and most importantly, his company. Each visit lasted a little longer than the last, as there always seemed to be another repair to make or skill to teach. He showed her how to set traps for rabbits, how to predict weather changes by watching the sky, and how to preserve meat when she was lucky enough to hunt successfully. She taught him to make bread with the sourdough starter she'd carefully maintained since Boston, shared the books she'd brought west with her, and gradually revealed the dreams she'd barely admitted to herself of a prosperous farm, perhaps an orchard, and someday children running through fields of wheat. It was during his 5th visit, as February's grip on the land began to loosen, that something shifted between them. They had spent the day clearing early spring debris from the creek that ran behind Zara's property, ensuring it would flow freely when the last of the snow melted. Tired but satisfied with their work, they sat side by side on a fallen log, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold. "I've been thinking," Xavier said, his voice thoughtful. "The freight business is good, but it's not what I want forever." "Your ranch in the valley?" Zara asked, remembering his dream. He nodded. "I've saved almost enough. There's a piece of land about 10 miles from here that might be available come summer. Old man Peterson's looking to move back east to live with his daughter." Zara's heart quickened. 10 miles isn't far." "No," Xavier agreed, turning to look at her directly. "It's not far at all." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, slowly, deliberately, Xavier reached out and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm despite the chill air. "Zara," he said, her name sounding different somehow in his voice. "I've crossed a lot of territory in my life, but I've never found anywhere that felt like coming home until I met you." Tears pricked at Zara's eyes. "I was so cold before you came," she whispered, "not just from the fire going out. I was cold inside." Xavier's free hand came up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle as if she were made of porcelain. "And now?" "Now I'm warm," she said simply. Even when you're not here, knowing you'll return keeps me warm." The kiss, when it came, was as natural as breathing, tentative at first, then deepening as they moved closer on the log, his arm encircling her waist, her hands finding their way to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "I should have done that weeks ago," Xavier murmured, his forehead resting against hers. Zara laughed softly. "I would have let you." That night, though propriety still dictated their sleeping arrangements, something had fundamentally changed in the cabin. The air between them hummed with possibility, with futures intertwining like the smoke from the fire that Xavier had first built, and Zara had faithfully maintained. As spring slowly awakened the land, Xavier's visits became more frequent. He began bringing seedlings for a garden, young fruit trees that might someday become an orchard, and always plans for improvements to Zara's homestead that sounded increasingly like their homestead. In late April, as they planted potatoes in the newly thawed soil, Xavier paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Peterson's accepted my offer," he said without preamble. "The land will be mine by June." Zara's hands stilled in the dirt. "That's wonderful news." "It needs work," Xavier continued, eyes fixed on the distant hills. "The cabin's solid but small. The barn needs a new roof. It'll take time to build it into what I've imagined." "All good things take time," Zara replied, thinking of her own slow progress. Xavier set down his spade and moved to kneel beside her in the freshly turned earth. "The thing is, Zara, I don't want to work that land alone. I don't want to build something just for myself anymore." Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "What are you saying, Xavier?" He took her dirt-stained hands in his. "I'm saying that the fire you've kept burning isn't just in that hearth, it's between us, and I don't want it to ever go out." He paused, gathering his courage. "I'm asking if you'd consider joining your claim to mine, not just the land, but your life. Would you marry me, Zara Finch?" Tears spilled down Zara's cheeks, cutting tracks through the smudges of soil. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with joy. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier Thornton." Their embrace there in the potato field was witnessed only by the mountains and sky, but it sealed a promise as vast as the territory stretching around them, a promise of partnership, of warmth against the cold, of a fire that would never die. They were married in early June by a traveling preacher who stopped in Billings. The ceremony was simple, attended by the few neighbors scattered within riding distance and some of Xavier's business associates from town. Zara wore a blue dress she'd ordered special from a catalog, and Xavier had a new shirt that made his eyes seem even more intensely blue. Their wedding night was spent in Zara's cabin, soon to be their secondary home, once Xavier's place was properly established. The awkwardness of new intimacy quickly gave way to tenderness and passion that left them both wondering how they'd waited so long. "I love you," Xavier whispered as moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating Zara's face on the pillow beside him. "Have since that first night when you pointed that shotgun at me with those determined eyes." Zara laughed softly, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingertips. "I think I loved you when you built that fire, and the cabin felt like home for the first time." The summer passed in a blur of hard work and happiness as they divided their time between Zara's established homestead and Xavier's newly acquired ranch. They decided to maintain both properties. Zara's would be primarily for crops, while Xavier's valley land was better suited for cattle and horses. Together, they expanded the cabin on Xavier's land, adding a proper bedroom, a larger kitchen, and a covered porch where they could watch the sunset over the mountains. They repaired the barn, dug a new well closer to the house, and began building a herd of cattle that would be the foundation of their future prosperity. In the evenings, exhausted but satisfied, they would sit together on that porch, planning and dreaming. Sometimes they rode to Zara's original cabin to tend her garden and orchard saplings, spending the night there when work required it. Both places were home now, connected by their shared vision and the trail Xavier had traveled so many times during that first winter. As autumn painted the hills in crimson and gold, Zara shared news that made their happiness complete. She was expecting their first child, due in the early spring. Xavier's joy was boundless. He immediately began plans for a cradle, a rocking chair, and all the things a baby might need. His protective instincts heightened. He insisted they spend the approaching winter at his ranch, where the cabin was now larger and better situated to weather the storms. "But my place," Zara began to protest. "We'll check on it regularly," Xavier assured her, "but I want you and our child near the doctor in Billings if needed." Recognizing the wisdom in his concern, Zara agreed. They carefully closed up her cabin for the winter, bringing her most treasured possessions to their main home and ensuring everything else was secured against the elements and potential intruders. As the first snow fell, they were snug in their expanded cabin. The fireplace that Xavier built was larger than the one in Zara's original home, but he had constructed it with the same care, using stones gathered from their land and techniques he'd learned over years of frontier living. "Remember that first fire?" Zara asked one evening as they sat before the hearth, her sewing in her lap, his hand resting gently on her growing belly. "I was so cold, so afraid." "And now?" Xavier's voice was soft, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Zara leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Now I know that even in the coldest winter, there's warmth to be found. You just need the right person to show you how to build the fire." The winter passed peacefully, their days filled with preparations for both spring planting and the baby's arrival. Xavier continued his freight business on a limited basis, never traveling farther than Billings and always returning the same day. In early March, as the first signs of thaw appeared in protected valleys, their daughter was born a strong, healthy girl with Xavier's blue eyes and a dusting of dark hair that promised to be as rich as Zara's auburn locks. "What shall we call her?" Xavier asked, cradling the tiny bundle with hands that seemed suddenly too large and rough for such a delicate task. Zara watched them, her heart so full it might burst. "Hope," she said without hesitation, "because that's what you brought me that night, hope in the darkness." "Hope Thornton," Xavier tested the name, smiling as the baby's fingers closed around his thumb. "It's perfect." As spring bloomed across the land, they took baby Hope to visit Zara's original cabin. The structure had weathered the winter well, thanks to their careful preparations. The garden Zara had planted the previous year was already showing signs of life, and the young fruit trees had survived their first winter. "It's strange to think how afraid I was here," Zara mused as they walked the property, Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms. "How close I came to giving up before you arrived." Xavier slipped his arm around her waist. "And look at us now. 2 homes, healthy livestock, a beautiful daughter, and land that's beginning to truly produce. All because you stopped during a storm and taught me how to build a proper fire," Zara said, leaning into his embrace. "No," Xavier corrected gently. "All because you were brave enough to open your door to a stranger and smart enough to learn what you needed to survive. The fire was just the beginning." That evening, as they prepared to return to their main home, Xavier paused on the porch of Zara's cabin, looking thoughtful. "What is it?" she asked, adjusting Hope's blanket against the cooling air. "I was just thinking about the future," he replied. "About Hope growing up between these 2 places, learning to ride in the valley and plant in your fields. About the other children we might have, the legacy we're building." "It's a good future," Zara said softly. Xavier nodded, his eyes reflecting the sunset. "The best part is that no matter which roof we're under, we're home as long as we're together." 5 years passed, bringing prosperity and growth to the Thornton family. Hope was joined by a brother, Samuel, and the 2 children thrived in the freedom of their dual homesteads. Xavier's cattle business expanded, while Zara's orchard began producing its first meaningful harvest of apples and pears. They had established a rhythm to their lives, winters spent primarily at Xavier's larger ranch home, summers divided between both properties as crops and livestock demanded. What had once been Zara's lonely cabin was now a bustling hive of activity during harvest season, with hired hands and neighboring families coming to help with the picking and preserving. On the anniversary of their first meeting that stormy night when Xavier had appeared on Zara's doorstep, they made a tradition of spending the evening at the original cabin, no matter the weather or workload. "It's important to remember where we started," Xavier would say as he built a fire in the hearth that had witnessed their beginning. On the 5th such anniversary, after the children had been tucked into the small bedroom that had once been Zara's alone, the couple sat before the fire, glasses of apple cider from their own orchard in hand. "I have something to show you," Xavier said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Do you remember this?" Zara took it curiously, unfolding it to reveal a land office map, similar to the one that had guided her west years ago. "What is this?" "The original map I was using when I got caught in that storm," Xavier explained. "I found it while going through some old things." Zara studied it, noticing markings and notes in Xavier's handwriting. "You had my cabin marked," she said, surprised. "But how? We'd never met." Xavier smiled, taking her hand. "Johnson, the man who saved me my first winter, he told me about a young woman homesteading alone near Crow Creek. Said if I was ever passing through, I should check to make sure she was faring well." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I'd planned to stop anyway, but the storm made it necessary rather than merely neighborly." Tears filled Zara's eyes. "All this time, I thought it was chance that brought you to my door." "Maybe it was fate dressed up as chance," Xavier suggested. "Or maybe just good people looking out for each other in a harsh land." Zara leaned against his shoulder, watching the fire that burned as steadily as their love. "Either way, I'm grateful. That fire you lit didn't just warm the cabin, it showed me what was possible when you don't have to face the cold alone." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "And it's never going to go out, Zara. Not as long as we tend it together." Outside, snow began to fall, a gentle reminder of winter's approach. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the family they'd built and the love they'd nurtured, there was only warmth, a warmth born of a cowboy's skilled hands and a woman's determined heart, a fire that had been lit on a desperate night and would continue burning through all the seasons of their lives together. As the years passed, the Thornton family's reputation grew throughout the territory. Their dual homesteads became known as Thornton Heights, producing some of the finest cattle and orchard fruits in Montana. Xavier's business acumen combined with Zara's careful management turned their modest beginnings into considerable prosperity. Hope grew into a confident young woman with her father's way with horses and her mother's head for figures. By 18, she was handling much of the orchard's business correspondence and keeping the farm's books with remarkable precision. Samuel, 3 years younger, had his father's build and natural charm, making him popular in town and a natural leader among the ranch hands. When Hope was 20, she caught the eye of the new schoolteacher in Billings, an educated young man from Denver, who appreciated both her intelligence and the frontier skills that no Eastern finishing school could have provided. Their courtship progressed with Xavier's cautious blessing and Zara's delighted encouragement. On the evening before Hope's wedding, Zara found herself alone in the original cabin, having come to gather special apples from the orchard for the wedding feast. The place was now used primarily as a summer residence and workspace during harvest, but it was still meticulously maintained, a testament to their beginning. As she stood in the main room, memories washed over her that desperate night, the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones, the pounding at the door that had changed everything. The sound of a horse approaching pulled her from her reverie. Moments later, Xavier appeared in the doorway, his hair now threaded with silver, but his eyes still that same striking blue. "Thought I might find you here," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door, the same peg where he'd hung it that first night. "Getting sentimental before we lose our daughter to married life?" Zara smiled, crossing to him. "Perhaps a little. I was just remembering. Good memories, I hope." Xavier's arms encircled her waist, as comfortable and right as they had been for over 2 decades. "The best," she assured him, "though it occurred to me that Hope has never heard the full story of how we met. She knows the general outline, but not the details." Xavier chuckled. "Like how you nearly shot me when I knocked on your door?" "Or how you showed me that I was building my fires all wrong," Zara countered, laughing. She should know these things before she starts her own life with James. Then we'll tell her tonight, Xavier decided. The whole story, from the beginning. That evening, with the wedding preparations complete, the family gathered in the main ranch house. Hope, radiant with pre-wedding excitement, listened wide-eyed as her parents recounted the tale of that fateful winter night and the months of courtship that followed. So you see, Zara concluded, her hand clasped in Xavier's, what looked like the worst night of my life turned out to be the beginning of everything good. Your father didn't just teach me how to build a fire that wouldn't go out, he showed me that the warmest hearth is the one you tend together. Hope's eyes glistened with tears. That's beautiful, Mother. And a little terrifying to think how close you came to giving up before Father arrived. Life out here is always balanced on that edge, Xavier said thoughtfully, between perseverance and surrender, between life and death. The difference is often just one person willing to help, one skill learned in time, one fire that catches when you need it most. Samuel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, spoke up. Is that why you two are so set on helping every newcomer who settles within 50 miles? Because someone helped you? Zara nodded. Precisely. Your father and I know what it means to face this land alone, and we know the difference that kindness can make. As the conversation continued, flowing into wedding details and family stories, Zara caught Xavier's eye across the table. The look that passed between them held the weight of their shared years, the struggles and triumphs, the children raised and the land tamed, the love that had started with a desperate knock on a cabin door and grown into something as solid as the mountains surrounding them. Hope's wedding the next day was everything a frontier celebration should be: practical but joyful, blending tradition with the realities of Montana life. The couple would live in town during the school year, but spend summers helping with the orchard and ranch, an arrangement that gave them independence while maintaining family connections. As autumn approached that year, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of harvest, Xavier and Zara found themselves once again at the original cabin, overseeing the apple picking. The orchard that had begun with a few saplings now spread across 5 acres, providing fruit not only for their own use, but for sale in Billings and as far away as Helena. We should expand the pressing shed next year, Xavier remarked as they watched workers load crates of apples onto wagons. The cider business is growing faster than we can keep up. Zara nodded, making a note in the small book she carried. At 52, she was still as organized and forward-thinking as she had been at 25, though wisdom and experience had softened some of her edges. Samuel was talking about trying a distillery operation, she mentioned. Apple brandy might be a good winter product when the fresh fruit is gone. Xavier considered this, his eyes scanning the productive land that had once been nothing but wild grass and hope. Our son has good instincts for business, reminds me of you, always looking for the next opportunity. He reminds me of you, Zara countered with a smile, always charming people into seeing things his way. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a wagon bearing the town's newspaper editor and his wife, who had become friends over the years. After exchanging greetings, the editor handed Xavier the latest edition. Thought you'd want to see this, he said, pointing to a headline on the front page. They're talking statehood again. Looks more serious this time. Xavier unfolded the paper, reading aloud. Montana Territory statehood bill gains support in Congress. Can you imagine? Zara said softly. When I came here, this was barely settled territory. Now we might become a proper state. We've seen a lot of changes, Xavier agreed, folding the paper. Railroads coming closer every year. Towns growing. Land that was going for pennies an acre when we started is worth real money now. That evening, after the workers had departed and they were alone in the cabin, Xavier built a fire in the hearth while Zara prepared a simple supper. It was their custom during harvest, working days at the orchard, and nights spent in the place where their story began. As they sat before the fire, Xavier stretched his legs toward the warmth, a familiar gesture that always reminded Zara of that first night. Do you ever regret it? He asked suddenly. Coming west on your own, facing all those hardships? Zara considered the question seriously, as was her way. "No," she said finally. "There were moments of doubt, certainly. That night before you arrived, I truly thought I might die alone in this cabin, but if I hadn't come, if I hadn't struggled, we would never have met. Everything we've built together would never have existed." Xavier reached for her hand, his touch still sending warmth through her after all these years. "I rode a lot of trails before I found my way to your door, Zara. Sometimes I think about all the choices, all the turns that had to happen exactly as they did to bring us to that moment." "Providence," Zara suggested, using a word from her more religious Boston upbringing. "Maybe so," Xavier agreed. "Or maybe just the best kind of luck, the kind you make by being in the right place at exactly the right time." As they prepared for bed in the small room that had once been Zara's alone, the familiar sounds of the Montana night surrounded them, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of wind through the orchard trees, the occasional stamp of horses in the improved barn. "It's still hard country," Xavier observed, drawing Zara into his arms beneath the quilt she'd made in their first year of marriage. "But it's our country now. We've put down roots deeper than I ever thought possible." Zara nestled against him, finding the perfect spot on his shoulder where she had rested her head for more than 20 years. "That's what happens when you stop running long enough to build a fire that lasts," she murmured sleepily. "Best thing I ever did," Xavier whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Stopping at your door that night." "Best thing we ever did," Zara corrected gently. "Deciding to face the wilderness together." Outside, the first frost of autumn silvered the ground, but within the cabin's walls, the warmth of their enduring love kept the cold at bay, just as it had from that very first night when a lonely woman had opened her door to a cowboy with an armload of firewood and the knowledge to kindle flames that would never die. 30 years after that fateful winter night, Zara stood on the porch of their main ranch house, watching as 3 generations of Thorntons gathered for the annual harvest celebration. At 75, her auburn hair had faded to silver, but her eyes remained as bright and observant as ever, missing nothing as she surveyed her family's legacy. Hope and her husband had 4 children of their own now, the eldest already showing signs of the same determination that had characterized both sides of the family. Samuel had married the daughter of a neighboring rancher, combining their lands to create one of the largest operations in the county. His 3 children were currently engaged in a lively game of tag around the apple barrels that had been brought up from the orchard. Xavier emerged from the barn, walking with the slight stiffness that had settled into his joints over the years, but still moving with purpose. At 78, he had gradually handed over the daily management of their businesses to their children, but he remained involved in all major decisions and was still known throughout Montana now, a state for nearly 30 years, as one of its pioneering settlers. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" he said, coming to stand beside Zara. "All these people, this life we've created." Zara leaned against him, their bodies finding their familiar alignment. "I was just thinking about how different things might have been if you hadn't stopped that night, if I had given up and headed back east as so many did." Xavier's arm slipped around her waist. "I would have found you eventually," he said with the confidence that had never left him. "Some things are just meant to be, Zara." The afternoon progressed with the comfortable rhythm of a family long accustomed to each other's ways. Food was shared, stories were told, and as the sun began to set, Xavier announced that he and Zara would be spending the night at the original cabin, as was their tradition during harvest. "Grandmother, can I come too?" asked Hope's youngest daughter, a spirited 10-year-old named Eliza, who had always been drawn to the stories of the family's beginnings. Zara exchanged a glance with Xavier before nodding. "Yes, I think that would be fitting. After all, you're old enough now to hear the full story of how this family began." The 3 set off in Xavier's wagon as twilight descended, the familiar trail to Zara's original homestead, now a well-maintained road connecting the 2 properties. The cabin itself had been expanded over the years, a proper second bedroom added, the kitchen enlarged, but the main room with its stone fireplace remained largely as it had been that first night. As Xavier built a fire with the same care he'd always shown, Zara settled into a rocking chair with Eliza at her feet. "You've heard parts of this story before," she began, "but tonight you'll hear it all, how a Boston girl who knew nothing of frontier life came to build all this with a cowboy who stopped to help during a storm." Eliza's eyes widened with anticipation. "Was it love at first sight, grandmother?" Zara laughed softly. "Hardly. I was pointing a shotgun at him, terrified he might be a bandit. And I was just hoping for a roof over my head before the blizzard hit," Xavier added, joining them as the fire caught and began to warm the room. "Love came later, after your grandmother saw that I could be useful." "Your grandfather is being modest," Zara corrected. "He didn't just help me, he saved my life. I was nearly out of firewood, my supplies were dwindling, and I had no idea how to survive a Montana winter." As the fire crackled in the hearth, the same hearth where their story had begun, Zara and Xavier took turns recounting their tale. They spoke of those first difficult years, of building their homes and businesses, of the challenges and joys of raising children on the frontier. Eliza listened raptly, occasionally interjecting with questions that showed her keen intelligence. "So this cabin is where it all started," she said finally, looking around with new appreciation. "This is where our family began." "This is where the fire was first lit," Xavier confirmed, his voice gentle with memory. "The fire that's kept burning all these years." Later, after Eliza had been tucked into bed in what had once been Zara's sleeping area, the couple sat before the fire, hands linked as they had been countless times before. "Do you think she understands," Zara asked softly, "what it means to build something that lasts?" Xavier considered this. "Maybe not fully, not yet. She's grown up with the results of our work, the established ranch, the productive orchard, the respect of the community. It's hard to imagine the emptiness that was here before, the risk we took in choosing this life." "But she will understand in time," Zara said with certainty. "Our story is in her blood, in the very land she'll inherit someday." Xavier nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "That's the real legacy, isn't it? Not just the property or the businesses, but the understanding that the most valuable things are built slowly, with patience and perseverance." "And love," Zara added, squeezing his hand. "Always with love." "Always," Xavier agreed, bringing her hand to his lips in a gesture that had lost none of its tenderness over 3 decades. As the night deepened around the cabin, the fire continued to burn steadily in the hearth, much like the love that had sustained them through the years, sometimes blazing with passion, sometimes glowing with quiet comfort, but never dying, never growing cold. Outside, Montana had changed dramatically since that winter night in 1873. Railroads crisscrossed the state, automobiles had begun to replace horses on many roads, and the isolation that had once defined frontier life had gradually given way to growing communities and modern conveniences. But within the walls of that cabin, something timeless remained, the essential truth that had guided Zara and Xavier Thornton through all the seasons of their life together, that the warmest fires are those tended by loving hands, and that even in the coldest darkness, hope can be kindled when 2 people choose to face the wilderness as one. As they prepared for sleep in the cabin that had witnessed both their beginning and the fulfillment of their shared dreams, Zara and Xavier Thornton held each other close, grateful for the storm that had brought them together and the fire they had never allowed to die. In the final years of their lives, Xavier and Zara Thornton became living legends in Montana. Their story of survival, perseverance, and enduring love was recounted at community gatherings and family reunions, growing richer with each telling. The 2 homesteads they had built into a thriving enterprise were now managed primarily by their grandchildren, though both Hope and Samuel remained actively involved in the family business. When Xavier passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, with Zara holding his hand as she had for nearly 60 years, the funeral was attended by people from across the state. The governor himself sent a letter acknowledging Xavier's contribution to Montana's development, and the local newspaper ran a front-page tribute to the man who had helped shape the region. Zara, though devastated by the loss of her partner, found strength in the legacy they had created together. She continued to live primarily at the main ranch house, surrounded by family, but made regular visits to the original cabin, which had been preserved as a tangible reminder of their beginning. It was during one such visit, on the anniversary of that snowstorm that had brought Xavier to her door, that Zara gathered her children, grandchildren, and the first of her great-grandchildren around the hearth that had witnessed so much of their family's history. At 83, Zara's health was beginning to fail, but her mind remained sharp, her voice still carrying the quiet authority that had guided their family for generations. "I wanted us to gather here today," she began, "because this hearth holds the story of our family. It was here that your grandfather taught me how to build a fire that would last not just with wood and kindling, but with courage, perseverance, and love." She looked around at the faces of her descendants, seeing echoes of Xavier in some, reflections of herself in others, and unique combinations that spoke of the family's growth and evolution. "When I came west as a young woman, I thought I was seeking only land and independence. What I found instead was the understanding that true strength comes from connection to the land, yes, but more importantly, to each other." Eliza, now a poised young woman of 23, sat closest to her grandmother, her hand resting gently on Zara's arm. "Grandfather always said you were the bravest person he'd ever known," she said softly. Zara smiled, memories washing over her. "We were brave together. That was the secret, facing each challenge not alone, but side by side." As the family shared stories and memories, the fire in the hearth burned steadily, tended now by the hands of the fourth generation of Thorntons. Outside, snow began to fall, echoing that long-ago night when a desperate young woman had opened her door to a stranger seeking shelter from the storm. 3 months later, Zara joined Xavier in the small family cemetery overlooking both homesteads. She went peacefully, having lived to see the spring blossoms on the orchard trees one last time. At her funeral, Eliza read from a journal Zara had kept throughout her life, sharing the entry from the day after Xavier had first arrived. "The cabin is warm for the first time since I arrived in Montana. The stranger Xavier has shown me that I've been building my fires all wrong. You need to create space for the flames to breathe," he said, arranging the wood in a way I'd never seen before. When his fire caught and began to grow, I felt something inside me growing to hope, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that I don't have to face this wilderness alone. The Thornton family continued to thrive in the decades that followed, weathering the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the changing face of agriculture in America. The original homesteads expanded into a diversified operation that included cattle ranching, apple orchards, a successful cider and brandy business, and eventually, a heritage tourism component that allowed visitors to experience the pioneer lifestyle that Zara and Xavier had lived. Through it all, the story of the cold cabin and the cowboy who lit a fire that never died remained at the heart of the family's identity, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth can be found when people come together with knowledge, determination, and love. And in that original cabin, now designated as a historic landmark, the hearth that Xavier had built and Zara had tended still stands a testament to a fire that was kindled on a desperate winter night and continued to burn through generations, warming not just a home, but the hearts of all who heard their story. In the early years of the 21st century, as Montana celebrated its statehood centennial, a young woman named Eliza Thornton Wilson stood before a gathering at the Montana Historical Society. At 75, she was the last living person to have known both Xavier and Zara personally, and she had been invited to share their story as part of the state's celebration of its pioneer heritage. "My grandparents came to Montana in different ways," she began, her voice strong despite her years. "My grandfather, Xavier Thornton, was already a seasoned frontiersman when he arrived, having worked cattle drives across several territories. My grandmother, Zara Finch Thornton, came directly from Boston, armed with determination but little practical knowledge of frontier life." She paused, looking out at the rapt faces of her audience. Their meeting was both chance and destiny, a snowstorm, a desperate need for shelter, and a woman brave enough to open her door to a stranger. What followed was not just a love story, though it certainly was that. It was also the story of Montana itself, of people from different backgrounds coming together to build something lasting in a challenging land. As Eliza continued, sharing details of her grandparents' lives that had been passed down through family stories and Zara's journals, the essence of their legacy became clear. The fire that Xavier had lit in Zara's cold cabin had indeed never died. It had instead spread through generations, warming a family, a community, and ultimately becoming part of the shared heritage of a state built by those who understood that survival depended on both individual strength and mutual support. The last time I saw my grandmother, Eliza concluded, she told me something I've carried with me all my life. Remember, she said, that the most important thing is not what you build, but who you build it with. The right person can make even the coldest night warm and the hardest task possible. As the audience rose in applause, outside the windows of the Historical Society, snow began to fall on the Montana landscape, a landscape forever marked by the love story that began when she slept alone in a cold cabin. But the cowboy lit a fire that never died.